Every day, millions of people board airplanes, trusting they'll land safely. But for a select few, the sky simply swallows them whole. Today, we're covering the 10 most disturbing aviation disappearances in history. These cases defy logic, break hearts, and fuel nightmares. If you love deep dives into the unexplained, please take a second to hit that subscribe button and give hype points. Now, fasten your seatbelts, look out the window, and let's get into it. At exactly 12 minutes past 7, on the evening of October 21st, 1978, a 20-year-old Australian pilot flying a small single-engine Cessna over the Bass Strait keyed his microphone and said, in a voice that has haunted aviation for almost 50 years, "It's hovering, and it's not an aircraft." Then, for exactly 17 seconds, the open radio broadcast an unexplained metallic, grinding, scraping sound. Then, silence. Frederick Valentich, his rented Cessna 182L, and whatever it was he was staring at in the sky above the ocean were never seen again. No wreckage, no body, no radar contact, no debris on any beach. The Australian government sealed the official file for decades. Acoustic engineers still can't tell you what made that noise on the tape. This is not a story about aliens. Not really. This is a story about the last 6 minutes of a young pilot's life and the impossible, unsolvable question of what he saw before he vanished. Let me take you to that evening, because you have to feel the world Frederick Valentich was flying into to understand what happened next. It's spring in Australia. October 21st, 1978. The sun is dropping over the state of Victoria and the sky is clear. The Bass Strait, that stretch of ocean between the Australian mainland and Tasmania, is calm. Visibility is essentially unlimited. This is, meteorologically speaking, a beautiful evening to fly. Culturally, though, something else is going on. In 1978, the entire Western world is in the grip of a UFO craze. Steven Spielberg's Close Encounters of the Third Kind came out less than a year earlier and made $500 million. Books about alien visitors are on every drugstore paperback rack. TV shows are packed with grainy sightings and government cover-up stories. The idea that something might be watching us from the sky is not fringe. It is mainstream entertainment. And it is right in the middle of all of that that we meet Frederick Valentich. Fred is 20 years old, young, ambitious, and desperate to become a commercial airline pilot. He's been flying for about a year and a half. He has around 150 hours in the air. He holds a Class 4 instrument rating, which permits him to fly at night, but only in clear visual conditions. He is not a total beginner, but he isn't a veteran either. And here's where you need to know something about Fred, because it's going to matter later. Fred is obsessed with UFOs, not casually, obsessively. He has told his father more than once that he is worried he might be attacked or abducted by aliens while flying alone at night. This isn't a passing thought for him. It's an active fear he carries with him into the cockpit. He also, according to investigators who later dug into his flying record, was not the world's most disciplined pilot. He had failed his commercial license exams multiple times. He had received official warnings for flying into controlled airspace when he wasn't supposed to. He had a documented history of deliberately flying blind into cloud cover in violation of his instrument rating. Now, on the evening of October 21st, Fred rents a Cessna 182L, tail number Victor Hotel Delta Sierra Juliet, and files a flight plan. He's going to fly from Moorabbin Airport in Melbourne, south down the coast and out over the Bass Strait to King Island. It should take about 90 minutes. But here's where the strangeness starts before he ever takes off, because Fred told two different people two different stories about why he was making this trip. To the airport officials, he said he was flying to King Island to pick up some friends. To others in his life, he said he was flying to pick up a load of crayfish. Both stories, when investigators checked them later, turned out to be lies. There were no friends, there was no crayfish order, and, most bizarrely, he never notified King Island Airport that he was coming, which is a basic thing you're required to do. Nobody knows why Fred Valentich was really flying over the Bass Strait that night. At 6:19 p.m., Fred lifts off from Moorabbin Airport into a clear golden sky and turns south along the coast. For about 45 minutes, everything is boring. He's flying at 4,500 feet. The air is smooth, the radio is quiet. Then, at 7:06 p.m., he calls Melbourne Flight Service. On the other end of the radio is an air traffic controller named Steve Roby. Fred's question is simple. He asks if there's any known traffic below 5,000 feet in his area. Roby checks his radar. He tells Fred, no, there's nothing there. And that is where the world of Frederick Valentich starts to come apart. For the next 6 minutes, Fred describes something impossible. He tells Roby there's an aircraft above him. It has 4 bright landing lights. It just passed over the top of his Cessna at high speed. It's coming from the east. It's playing games with him. Roby asks him to describe it. Fred says it seems to be orbiting his plane. It has a long, shiny, metallic surface. There's a distinct green light on it. Roby is confused. His radar still shows nothing. He asks Fred to confirm what he's seeing. Fred is not calm anymore. His voice is starting to change. He describes the object approaching him again, from below. He says it's not an aircraft. Then, at 7:12 p.m., Fred reports that his engine has started to cough. It's idling roughly. Something is wrong with the plane. Roby asks him one more time to identify the aircraft, and Fred says the sentence, "It's hovering, and it's not an aircraft." The microphone stays open. For 17 full seconds, the radio broadcasts a sound, not static, not silence, a specific, described by multiple audio engineers sound, metallic, grinding, scraping, like 2 pieces of metal being rubbed hard against each other. Then the transmission cuts. Frederick Valentich is gone. Okay, stop the tape. Because this is the part of the story where everyone has a theory and none of the theories quite fit. Let's take them apart one at a time. Theory 1, the upside-down theory. This is the most popular skeptic argument. It says that Fred, a young pilot with limited nighttime experience, became spatially disoriented in the dark over featureless black ocean. That he flew his Cessna into what's called a graveyard spiral, a tight downward turn that a disoriented pilot can't recover from. That he was seeing the reflection of his own aircraft's landing lights on the surface of the water and mistaking them for another craft. Fine. Except, wait a minute, really look at it. A Cessna 182L runs on a gravity-fed fuel system. That means fuel drips down from the wing tanks into the engine by simple gravity. If you flip that airplane upside down or hold it in a hard spin, the fuel stops flowing to the engine within seconds. It coughs, it sputters, it dies. Fred was on the radio describing this object for 6 full minutes, not 6 seconds, 6 minutes. If he was upside down or in a full graveyard spiral for 6 minutes, the engine would have starved and stalled almost immediately. He wouldn't have had time to describe metallic surfaces and green lights and orbiting movements. He would have crashed into the water in the first 30 seconds. Theory 2, the star delusion. The official Australian Department of Transport investigation eventually suggested that Fred might have been fooled by a bright celestial object. Venus, Mars, a meteor, a satellite. But here's the problem with that. Venus doesn't hover. Venus doesn't orbit your airplane. Venus doesn't approach from below. Venus doesn't have 4 separate landing lights. And Venus does not, under any known condition of physics, cause a Cessna's engine to start running rough. The idea that a young pilot with an instrument rating mistook a stationary planet for a maneuvering craft for 6 continuous minutes and simultaneously suffered an unrelated engine failure that happened to line up perfectly with the timing of that mistake is a coincidence stack that starts to break down under its own weight. Theory 3, the metallic scraping. Those 17 seconds of audio at the end of the tape are genuinely the most disturbing part of the whole case, because it isn't just noise. Audio engineers have gone over that recording for decades, multiple analyses. The consistent description is a metallic, grinding sound, something physically scraping against something else. What was that? Was it Fred's Cessna colliding with the object he was describing? Was it Fred's plane breaking apart in a stall? Was it a stuck microphone rubbing against the interior of a spinning cockpit? Or was it something the audio was picking up from outside the aircraft altogether? There is no consensus. There is no answer. Theory 4, the missing airplane. The Australian Navy and Air Force ran an extensive search over the following days. Over 1,000 square miles of the Bass Strait were combed. This is a shallow strait, not the deep Pacific. If a Cessna crashed into it, debris would float. There would be an oil slick. There would be pieces of red and white fuselage. They found nothing, not one thing. Not a seat cushion, not a wing panel, not a shoe. And then there's the fifth theory, the uncomfortable one, the one nobody really wants to say out loud. Because you can't ignore what we know about Fred. He was personally obsessed with UFOs. He genuinely feared alien abduction while flying at night. He lied about the reason for his flight. He didn't notify his destination airport that he was coming. He had a track record of reckless flying and failed exams. Is it possible that Frederick Valentich staged the whole thing? That he flew below radar coverage, landed somewhere else, and disappeared into a new life on purpose? Investigators have never ruled it out completely. There is no evidence he did. But there's also no evidence he didn't. Which explanation you believe probably says more about you than it does about Fred. The Australian government eventually classified Frederick Valentich as legally deceased, presumed lost at sea. The official cause of the disappearance was listed as unknown. The full investigation file was kept sealed from the public for over 2 decades, which has, of course, done absolutely nothing to slow down the theories. A civilian named Roy Manifold was standing on Cape Otway earlier that same evening, taking sunset photographs on a tripod, and reportedly captured a strange, fast-moving shape rising out of the water. Independent witnesses driving near the coast that night claimed they saw a green light hovering just above a small aircraft that was descending steeply toward the ocean. None of it has ever been fully explained. None of it has ever been fully dismissed. Almost 50 years later, we are no closer to knowing what happened out there. A 20-year-old pilot, obsessed with the stars, ambitious for a career in the sky, took off in a rented plane on a beautiful spring evening, flew out over the Bass Strait, and told the world through his radio that there was something above him that was not an aircraft. Then, his microphone recorded 17 seconds of a sound that no one has ever been able to name. Then he was gone. Whatever Fred Valentich saw hovering over the Bass Strait on the evening of October 21st, 1978, hovering over him with its 4 landing lights and its shining metallic surface and its distinct green glow, is still, in every meaningful sense, hovering there, waiting for somebody to tell us what it was. Just before 7 o'clock on the evening of November 23, 1953, a United States Air Force radar operator sitting in a dark, quiet room in northern Michigan watched something happen on his screen that should have been physically impossible. 2 green blips, one representing an American jet fighter, one representing an unknown intruder, closed in on each other over the black freezing surface of Lake Superior. They converged, they touched, and then, in the words of every witness in that radar room, they merged, not crossed, not passed, merged into a single green dot of light. The American jet, an F-89 Scorpion carrying 2 experienced Air Force officers, never came out the other side. The single merged blip calmly turned, drifted south for a moment, then vanished from the screen entirely. Lieutenant Felix Monclaw Jr. and Lieutenant Robert Wilson never came back. No wreckage, no bodies, no debris, nothing. This is the Kinross incident. And unlike most military UFO stories, this one isn't based on eyewitness claims or grainy photographs. This one is based on cold, measurable radar data recorded on official United States Air Force equipment. And 72 years later, the Air Force still cannot logically explain what happened. Let me set the scene for you, because you have to feel the tension of this specific moment in history to understand why what happened over Lake Superior mattered so much. It's late November of 1953. The Korean War ended just 4 months earlier. The Soviet Union has, at this point, successfully tested both an atomic bomb and a hydrogen bomb. The Cold War is no longer a possibility. It is the world we live in. And the United States military is completely convinced that the next war, if it comes, is going to arrive over the North Pole in the form of Soviet long-range bombers dropping thermonuclear warheads on American cities. To stop that from happening, the U.S. Air Force has built a giant network of radar stations along the entire northern border of the country. These stations watch the sky 24 hours a day. And when they see something that shouldn't be there, they scramble jets. One of those bases is Kinross Air Force Base in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, a grim, frozen place in November. Lake Superior sits just to the north, 600 feet deep, black as ink, with snow squalls whipping across its surface and temperatures well below freezing. On the evening of November 23rd, a radar station codenamed Pillow detects something at 1817 in the evening. An unidentified aircraft, about 160 miles northwest of Kinross, drifting in over the lake. And whatever it is moving too slow to be a jet, and it does not answer the standard identification signal that friendly aircraft are supposed to return automatically. That is a Cold War red alert. At Kinross, the alarm goes off. Two men run for a hangar. The first is Lieutenant Felix Moncla Jr., 27 years old, a World War II veteran who had re-enlisted for the Korean War, a qualified all-weather interceptor pilot with 811 total flight hours, 121 of them specifically in the notoriously unforgiving F-89 Scorpion. Not a rookie. The second is his radar operator, Lieutenant Robert L. Wilson. Sitting in the rear seat of the Scorpion, Wilson's job is to run the jet's onboard intercept radar and lock the aircraft's weapons onto whatever they find. He is one of a small number of officers specifically trained on the F-89's sophisticated targeting system. Their aircraft is a Northrop F-89C Scorpion, and this thing is a beast. It's an all-weather interceptor, which means it's designed to hunt enemy aircraft in exactly the kind of conditions Moncla is about to fly into. Blinding snow, zero visibility, pitch black. It carries a nose full of unguided rockets. Its call sign tonight is Avenger Red. At 6:22 in the evening, Avenger Red thunders off the runway at Kinross and climbs into the storm. For the next 30 minutes, this becomes one of the most tightly monitored, tightly documented military intercepts of the Cold War era. Because visibility is essentially zero, Moncla can't see anything with his own eyes. He is being guided entirely by radar. The men at the Pillow ground station are watching two green blips on their scope. One is Moncla's F-89, the other is the unknown aircraft. The Pillow operator radios Moncla, telling him what course to fly to close in on the target. At 6:47, Pillow tells Moncla to descend from 30,000 feet down to 7,000 feet, where the unknown bogey is cruising below the cloud deck. Moncla acknowledges. At 6:51, Moncla turns to a heading of 20 degrees magnetic. He is now barreling northwest across Lake Superior at over 500 miles per hour. At 6:52, Pillow radios one final time. Target at 11 o'clock, 10 miles out. Moncla clicks his microphone and acknowledges the transmission. That's the last time anybody hears his voice. For the next 3 minutes, everyone in the radar room at Pillow watches the two green blips converge. Moncla is closing in at high speed. The unknown target is not evading, not accelerating, not showing any sign of hostile maneuvering. It just keeps flying calmly, letting the F-89 chase it down. At approximately 6:55 p.m., the two blips touch, and then something on that radar screen happens that every single officer in that room later swore they saw. Something that violates the basic physics of radar. The two blips don't cross. They don't pass through each other and separate. They merge into one blip on the screen. And at the exact same moment, the F-89's identification friend or foe transponder, the little box that shouts, "I'm an American military aircraft to any radar in range," abruptly shuts off. Just gone. The room goes silent. Pillow tries to raise Moncla on the radio. Nothing. They watch the single merged blip drift south for a few seconds, and then, calmly, the whole thing turns and vanishes off the top of the radar screen, heading north into Canadian airspace. The jet, the pilot, and the radar operator are gone. And now, this is where the story picks up one last cold, unexplained detail. Just over 40 minutes later, at 7:35 p.m., a second F-89 Scorpion, call sign Avenger Black, is scrambled to search for Moncla. Its pilot and radar officer report hearing a faint, garbled transmission on the emergency frequency. Just 5 seconds long. Voice unintelligible. But both of them, independently, swear they recognized Felix Moncla's voice, Nobody has ever explained what they heard. Okay, stop the tape. Because now the United States Air Force is going to spend the next 70 years trying to explain this in 3 different, mutually contradictory ways. Problem 1, the Canadian contradiction. The first official explanation the Air Force put out to reporters within days of the incident was that the mystery bogey Moncla had been chasing was a Royal Canadian Air Force C-47 Dakota transport plane that had drifted off course. Simple, boring, embarrassing, but not conspiratorial. Moncla either collided with it or suffered a vertigo attack while trying to intercept it. But wait a minute. Almost immediately after that statement went out, the Canadian government fired back a public denial. Not a soft denial. A fierce, official, categorical denial. The RCAF stated flatly that they had absolutely no aircraft anywhere near Lake Superior on the evening of November 23rd. No C-47, no transport, no plane at all. And when reporters pressed the U.S. Air Force to reconcile that, the story quietly changed. Now, suddenly it wasn't a Canadian plane. Now it was probably a lost civilian aircraft. Then, it was probably some other unspecified, misidentified target. Then, eventually, the Air Force just stopped commenting on what the bogey had been. Hold on. If the American Air Force scrambled an armed interceptor to chase what they thought was a Soviet incursion, and that intruder turned out to be nothing more than a friendly Canadian transport plane, that's the kind of thing you can prove. You produce a flight plan. You produce a pilot who says, "Oh yeah, that was me." You produce a base commander who confirms his aircraft was up. The Canadians produced none of that, because according to them, there was no aircraft. So what was Moncla chasing? Problem 2. The impossible merge. Let's talk about radar physics for a second. When 2 aircraft fly close to each other at high speed, their radar returns get very close on the screen. They can even briefly overlap into one large, fuzzy return. But then they separate, because they're 2 solid objects moving through space. Physics doesn't allow one solid metal aircraft to be absorbed into another one. If Moncla had crashed while flying under or over the unknown bogey, the radar physics is very clear. His blip would have dropped down and disappeared. The other blip would have continued on its way. 2 separate objects, 2 separate outcomes. That is not what happened. Multiple radar operators on the record, sworn testimony, described the 2 blips converging and locking together into a single object, not overlapping, locking, and then the merged object flew off intact. The Air Force's later suggestion, quietly, was that Moncla had suffered vertigo, lost control, and crashed into the lake. But here's the thing. Pilot vertigo was never listed as the cause in the actual accident investigation board findings. It was just floated to journalists as a plausible-sounding excuse. And it doesn't explain the radar merge. Vertigo makes a pilot lose situational awareness. Vertigo doesn't cause 2 aircraft to become one on a radar screen. Problem 3. The empty lake. If Moncla's F-89 slammed into Lake Superior at over 500 miles per hour, the impact would have shattered the aircraft into thousands of pieces. Fuel would have poured into the water. Life rafts, seat cushions, ejection seats, personal effects, floating debris would have coated the surface for miles. The United States Coast Guard, the Royal Canadian Air Force, and multiple search parties scoured the exact coordinates of the radar merge for weeks, in the days after the incident, in the weeks after. And nothing was ever found. Not a drop of aviation fuel, not a single life vest, not a helmet, not one shred of aluminum from a 30,000-pound military interceptor. 20 tons of jet aircraft did not vanish into 600 feet of water and leave nothing behind. That's not what happens. And then, in 2006, a group calling itself the Great Lakes Dive Company briefly made international news, claiming they had located Moncla's pristine F-89 intact on the lake bed, next to what they described as a teardrop-shaped metallic object. Civilian researchers quickly proved the whole thing was a hoax. Their spokesman didn't exist. Their photos were faked, so the mystery didn't get solved. It just got dirtier. The official finding of the United States Air Force on the disappearance of Lieutenant Felix Moncla Jr. and Lieutenant Robert L. Wilson, filed after the accident investigation, listed the cause of the loss of Avenger Red as undetermined, That is the actual, on-the-record historical position of the United States military, undetermined, and that is why the Kinross incident, 72 years later, sits in a category almost entirely by itself. It isn't a case that depends on a single eyewitness. It isn't a case that depends on a grainy photograph or a hoaxed radio transmission. It is a case that turns on a piece of radar data recorded on official military equipment, watched in real time by trained Air Force officers, in a room designed to detect exactly this kind of anomaly. Something merged with an F-89 Scorpion over Lake Superior on the evening of November 23, 1953. That is a documented fact. Whatever that something was, it flew away. And it took 2 American Air Force officers, a state-of-the-art interceptor jet, and every piece of physical evidence with it. Somewhere at the bottom of a very cold, very deep, very dark lake, a mystery is still sitting there, undisturbed. Or maybe it isn't. Maybe it was never there at all. Maybe it went somewhere else. That is the part nobody has ever been able to answer. 2 men climbed into a jet on a snowy November night and flew out over the frozen darkness of Lake Superior to chase something the government could not name. And the something took them home with it. On the late morning of August 16, 1942, a United States Navy blimp came drifting down out of the clouds and scraped its way across the rooftops of a suburb south of San Francisco. It was sagging in the middle, deflating, silent. Kids on the sidewalk stopped to point at it. Housewives stepped out onto their porches. And after a slow-motion crash across the front lawns of Daly City, the enormous gray airship came to a gentle rest right in the middle of a residential street called Bellevue Avenue. The San Francisco police and fire departments came running. Firefighters climbed up onto the twisted gondola, expecting to pull 2 injured pilots out of the wreckage. But when they opened the cabin door, both men were gone. The radio was working. The engines were switched off, but perfectly functional. The parachutes were still folded on the wall. The life raft was untouched. The classified code books were sitting right there on the table where they'd been left. Everything on that blimp was exactly where it should have been. Except the 2 experienced Navy aviators who had taken off from Treasure Island 5 hours earlier. This is the story of the L-8, and it is one of the strangest disappearances in the history of the United States military. Let me set the scene for you, because this happened in a very specific and very tense moment in American history. It's August of 1942. The United States has been at war for 8 months. Pearl Harbor is still an open wound, and the west coast of California is drenched in paranoia. Japanese submarines have already surfaced off American shores. The oil field at Elwood, near Santa Barbara, was shelled by a Japanese sub earlier in the year. Fort Stevens up in Oregon was shelled too. So on the beaches from San Diego up to Seattle, ordinary Americans genuinely believed that any morning could bring a landing party or a periscope or an attack from the sea. To watch for that, the Navy has an entire fleet of blimps flying up and down the coast. Not the giant airships you're thinking of, smaller, 250 feet long, helium-filled, slow. They putter along at about 45 miles an hour, low and quiet, scanning the surface of the ocean for oil slicks, periscopes, and shadows in the water. They're the eyes of the fleet. One of those blimps is the L-8, and on the morning of August 16th, the L-8 is assigned a routine anti-submarine patrol out of a base on Treasure Island in San Francisco Bay. The crew is 2 men, and these are not rookies, not even a little bit. The pilot is Lieutenant Ernest DeWitt Cody, 27 years old, a seasoned naval aviator with hundreds of hours in airships, steady, calm, respected, the kind of officer who does everything by the book. His co-pilot is Ensign Charles Ellis Adams, 35 years old, and Adams is not just experienced. Adams is a legend inside the Navy's airship community. He is a decorated veteran. He has been flying in these things for years, and here's the detail that matters. Adams was on board the USS Macon, the giant Navy airship that famously crashed into the Pacific back in 1935. He survived it. He knows exactly what it feels like when one of these things goes down. He knows exactly what you're supposed to do to save yourself. There was supposed to be a 3rd man on the flight, a mechanic named James Riley Hill. But at the last minute, Cody looked at the weather and did the math. It was a foggy morning. The morning dew was making everything heavier than usual. Airships are all about balance. Too much weight and you don't get enough altitude. So Cody bumped Hill off the manifest to save weight. That decision saved Hill's life. At 6:03 in the morning, the L-8 lifts off from Treasure Island and climbs slowly out over San Francisco Bay. The fog is heavy but starting to burn off. The plan is a standard 50-mile radius sweep. Head out past the Golden Gate, loop out over the Farallon Islands, check for anything suspicious on the surface of the sea. For the first hour and a half, it's a completely normal patrol. Then, at 7:38 a.m., Cody gets on the radio. He tells base station that he's spotted a suspicious oil slick on the water near the Farallon Islands. He's going down for a closer look. He drops 2 smoke flares to mark the location. And that is the last time anyone ever hears Lieutenant Cody's voice. Now, this next part is important because it means we actually have witnesses to what happened next. There were 2 civilian fishing boats in the area that morning. The crews on those boats had been watching the blimp for a while. When the L-8 dropped down to investigate the oil slick, the sailors on both boats kept their eyes on it. It was a big gray floating thing about the size of a football field, impossible to miss. They watched the L-8 descend to about 30 feet above the water. They watched it circle the oil, slick, tight, and slow. And then they watched it climb back up into the clouds, disappearing above the cloud deck at around 2,000 feet. Nothing dramatic, no splash, no emergency. Nobody visible on the ropes, nobody falling out of the cabin. Just a blimp doing exactly what a blimp is supposed to do and then flying off into the fog. But wait a minute. Back at base, at 8:50 a.m., the radio operators realize they have completely lost contact with the L-8. Nothing. No response, no check-in. Silence. At 9 a.m., the L-8 breaks back through the clouds. Except now it's rising. It's climbing on its own to over 2,000 feet, and it's drifting east, back toward the California coastline, away from its patrol route. Nobody at Treasure Island has any way to reach the crew. By 11:15 in the morning, the L-8 touches down on Ocean Beach in broad daylight, right at the edge of San Francisco. Local surfers see it coming and run toward it, trying to grab the mooring lines like a runaway kite. As they yank on the ropes, the gondola strikes a cliff, and one of the 2 160-pound depth charges strapped underneath breaks loose and falls off. That sudden loss of weight causes the whole airship to lurch back up into the sky. And then, for the next 15 minutes, one of the strangest scenes in American military history plays out over the suburbs south of San Francisco. This massive, sagging, silent Navy blimp drifts slowly across neighborhoods. Homeowners come out and stare up at it. It scrapes rooftops. It brushes power lines. It looks like a dying whale floating through the sky. And then, just before 11:30 a.m., the L-8 collapses gently down in the middle of Bellevue Avenue in Daly City, folded across 2 front lawns, and comes to rest. The police and the fire department come running. They climb up onto the gondola. They open the door. The cabin is empty. Okay, stop the tape. Because now you have to understand exactly what those first responders were looking at inside that cabin and why it makes no sense. Let's talk about what they found. The radio was fully functional, tested and working right there in the cabin, ready to transmit. The engines were switched off but showed no mechanical fault whatsoever. Ground crews later ran them up and they performed perfectly. Both of the crew's parachutes were still folded neatly against the wall, untouched. The rubber life raft was still stowed in its compartment, never deployed. The classified code books were sitting on the table in the cabin. In wartime, those books were priceless. Standard operating procedure said you were supposed to throw them overboard, weighted if there was any chance of the aircraft being captured. They were never touched. The starboard door of the gondola was latched open, just standing open. The external megaphone switch was set to stand by, not off. Standby. As if one of the crew had been about to use it to shout at something on the surface of the water, and the 2 crew members' life jackets missing, which is important because Navy protocol required them to be worn at all times on patrol. If the jackets were missing from the cabin, that means both men were wearing them when they left. The official Navy assumption was the obvious one. One of them, probably Cody, opened the door to shout at the oil slick through the megaphone. He slipped or leaned too far. He fell. Adams rushed over to grab him. Adams also fell. The sudden loss of about 350 pounds of body weight from the front of the cabin caused the blimp to instantly climb straight up into the sky and disappear into the clouds. Case closed. But wait a minute, really look at that theory. Problem 1, the safety gear. If either of those men thought they might fall out, or if one of them was about to try to catch the other, why in the world would they not first grab a parachute or unclip the life raft? These are men whose entire training is about survival gear. Adams literally survived the crash of the USS Macon. He didn't survive that by ignoring his safety equipment. He survived it by using it. Why on earth would two experienced Navy veterans willingly abandon their aircraft over the Pacific Ocean with no parachute, no raft, and no way to signal for help? Problem 2. The radio. The radio was 2 steps away, working perfectly. And in a genuine emergency, in the time it took for one man to slip out the door and the second to reach for him, it takes literally 2 seconds to key the microphone and shout the word Mayday. But there was silence. Complete silence from the moment of the oil slick call. That is not a crew fighting for their lives. That is a crew that was somehow prevented from speaking. Problem 3. And this is the one nobody has ever been able to explain. There were witnesses, 2 fishing boats, multiple sailors, watching the L-8 the entire time it was near the oil slick, and not one of them saw a splash. Not one of them saw 2 men in blue Navy uniforms tumble out of a hovering aircraft into the water. Not one of them saw a body float on the surface. How do 2 grown men in full uniform vanish from a low hovering aircraft in broad daylight while multiple people are actively watching? They don't. That's not physics. The Navy launched a huge search. Ships, planes, Coast Guard boats, they scoured the waters off the Farallon Islands for days, and they did not find a single thing. No bodies, no life jackets floating on the surface, no wreckage, no sign at all that Cody and Adams had ever been in the ocean. In 1943, the Navy Board of Investigation officially declared the 2 men legally dead, and in the report that they filed, when they sat down to write their conclusions on what had actually happened to Lieutenant Ernest DeWitt Cody and Ensign Charles Ellis Adams, the United States Navy essentially threw up its hands. The report used the words "cause unknown." The L-8 itself was towed away, quietly repaired and put right back into service. It flew for years after the war. It even served as a Goodyear blimp at Super Bowl broadcasts in the 1960s and 1970s. The airship came home. The men did not. Somewhere over the Pacific Ocean, on a foggy morning in August of 1942, at an altitude of about 30 feet, 2 experienced Navy aviators stepped out of a perfectly functioning aircraft and into a hole in the world, and nobody has ever found them. On the evening of May 25, 2003, at a busy international airport on the coast of Africa, a 150-foot commercial airliner started its engines, taxied out onto the runway without permission, turned off all of its exterior lights, disabled the transponder that broadcasts its identity to the world, and then blasted into the sky toward the open Atlantic Ocean. Nobody knows who was flying it. Nobody knows where it went. And in the 23 years since it lifted off from that runway, no debris, no wreckage, no radar contact, and no satellite image of a 100-ton Boeing 727 has ever surfaced. Not a bolt, not a bar of aluminum, nothing. The CIA looked, the FBI looked, the United States military looked, and this happened less than 2 years after September 11th, when the entire Western world was watching every plane on the planet. They found nothing. This is the story of the ghost plane of Luanda. Let me paint the picture for you, because this whole thing takes place in a very specific kind of world you probably haven't imagined. The setting is 4 de Fevereiro International Airport in Luanda, the capital of Angola. And in 2003, Angola is a country crawling out from underneath a brutal, decades-long civil war. It's an oil economy. It's a diamond economy, and Luanda's airport is a hub for the shady, half-legal cargo trade that keeps everything moving. Rough tarmac, under-maintained aircraft, corrupt officials. Millions of dollars in unpaid parking fees on jets that have been rusting in the African sun for years, while their owners argue with lawyers halfway around the world. Sitting on that tarmac in a poorly lit corner of the airport is one of those forgotten airplanes, a Boeing 727-223. Tail number November 844 Alpha Alpha. It's 28 years old. It used to fly for American Airlines back in the day, ferrying passengers between U.S. cities. But those days are long gone. This plane has been stripped and sold and stripped and sold again. Now it sits, unpainted, dull silver, weathered with the words American faintly visible where the old airline logo used to be. And here's the weird part. If you climb up the stairs and look inside the cabin, all the passenger seats are gone, ripped out, replaced with 10 enormous 500-gallon fuel tanks. This plane isn't a passenger jet anymore. It has been converted into a flying fuel truck used to haul diesel out to remote diamond mines deep in the African interior. It's been sitting there, grounded, for over a year. $4 million in unpaid airport fees. Its owner, a shady American aircraft leasing outfit, is trying to figure out how to get it back into the sky and out of Angola before the government seizes it. Enter two men. The first is Ben Charles Padilla Jr., 51 years old, American, a licensed aircraft mechanic, a certified flight engineer. Padilla is the guy his employer sends into difficult places to fix broken airplanes and quietly get them home. He's talented, he's tough, he's spent years working in Africa and Asia, patching together aging jets in places most Western mechanics wouldn't fly to on a vacation. And, crucially, Padilla has a private pilot's license, not a commercial one. A private one, the kind you get to fly small single-engine planes on the weekend. The second man is John Michael Mutantu. He's Congolese, he's a helper, hired to assist Padilla with basic mechanical work. He has 0 pilot qualifications whatsoever. That's it. That is the entire crew of what is about to happen. It's late afternoon on May 25th. The sun is starting to set over the Atlantic. The tarmac is hot, the air's heavy. Padilla and Mutantu climb aboard the 727. Officially, they're supposed to be running systems checks, testing the engines at full power, making sure everything works. That's what they told the ground crew. At around 5 p.m., the 3 massive Pratt & Whitney engines of the 727 roar to life. And that would have been perfectly normal, except for what happens next. The plane starts to move. It doesn't taxi normally. It swerves. It jerks. Anyone watching from the tower can see something is wrong. This isn't a professional pilot at the controls. This is somebody wrestling with a machine they're not fully in control of. The transponder is off. The transponder is that little box that tells air traffic control who you are, how high you're flying, where you are. It's how planes talk to radar. It has been manually disabled. The exterior navigation lights, the ones that would let anyone else in the sky see this plane coming, are also off. Completely dark. The tower starts screaming into the radio. What are you doing? Identify yourself. Return to parking immediately. Silence. The 727 rolls itself onto the active runway, without clearance, without permission, without communication. It lines up. And then, with the sun sinking into the Atlantic in front of it, the engines wind up to full takeoff power, and this 100-ton airplane, loaded with 14,000 gallons of jet fuel, thunders down the runway and lifts into the sky. It banks southwest, out over the ocean, away from the coast into the dark, and then it's gone. Okay? Stop the tape. Because this is where the whole thing stops making sense. The immediate response was panic. This is 2003, less than 2 years after September 11th. The idea of a commercial airliner going rogue was not a hypothetical. That was the entire nightmare that had defined American foreign policy for the past 20 months. And now, in one of the most unstable regions of the world, a 727 loaded with fuel, converted with extra fuel tanks in the cabin, has been stolen and is flying somewhere over Africa with no one identifying it. Within hours, the CIA gets involved. So does the FBI. So does U.S. Central Command. Every intelligence agency in the Western world is looking for this plane. Because if this aircraft had been seized by hostile actors intending to use it against international diplomatic or energy facilities in the region, the consequences would be catastrophic. They watch the skies, they pull satellite imagery, they interview witnesses, they lean on every informant they have in every terror network in Africa and the Middle East. And they find nothing. Now let's talk about why this whole thing is impossible on multiple levels. Problem 1. The pilot. The most popular theory is that Ben Padilla just stole the plane. Maybe for a payout, maybe for a cartel, maybe he snapped. But wait a minute. Let's think about that for a second. A Boeing 727 is a beast. In its normal operating configuration, it required a 3-person crew, a captain, a first officer, a flight engineer. That's not a suggestion. That's how the plane was designed. There are so many systems to monitor, so many switches to flip, so many gauges to watch that no single human being can safely operate one. And Padilla, remember, held a private pilot's license for small planes, Cessnas, little single-engine aircraft that a hobbyist might fly on a Sunday. He was not type-rated on the 727. He had never gotten the specific certification you need to fly this specific aircraft. He was a mechanic, not a jet pilot. So how does one guy, at dusk, taxi an unfamiliar heavy jet down an unfamiliar runway, execute a takeoff, retract the landing gear, manage the throttle and the flaps and the trim, and keep a 100-ton aircraft flying? The uncomfortable answer is, he probably couldn't. Which means one of two things. Either Padilla was an aviation prodigy, self-taught to a superhuman degree, or, and this is what a lot of investigators quietly believe, somebody else was already on that plane before he boarded. Somebody with the skills to fly it, somebody who never showed up on any manifest. Problem 2. The motive. Let's play out the theft theory. Say a group of criminals stole this plane. What do you do with it? You can't just fly a Boeing 727 to a random airstrip in the jungle and land it. This is not a small aircraft. It needs a real runway, real fuel, real ground support to keep it flying. You can't fence it. You can't put a stolen Boeing 727 on the black market. It's got serial numbers on every part. Any aviation buyer in the world would spot it in a second. You can't disassemble it easily. Taking apart a jet like this and selling it for parts requires specialized equipment and a location where nobody is going to ask questions for weeks, maybe months. So what is the point? What is the point of stealing a plane you can't sell, can't fly for long, and can't hide? Unless the whole thing was insurance fraud on the ground end, and the plane was flown out just to be dumped in the ocean to make the paperwork clean. That is one of the theories U.S. intelligence took very seriously. The plane's ownership history was full of financial red flags and lawsuits. But even then, you'd still need somebody who could actually fly the thing to the middle of the Atlantic and put it down. Which brings us right back to problem 1. Problem 3, and this is the biggest one. This is 2003. The Cold War is over. Every intelligence agency on Earth is watching the skies. NORAD is watching. AWACS aircraft are up. Satellite imagery is being tasked in real time. Coast guards are alerted. Naval assets are repositioned. And somehow, a 150-foot commercial airliner, one of the most recognizable machines humans have ever built, took off from a monitored international airport and simply vanished from the picture. No radar contact. No satellite hit, no secondary sighting from a fishing boat or an oil rig or a passing cargo ship. Where do you hide a Boeing 727? In the modern world, on a planet with over 8,000 active satellites, in an ocean crisscrossed by shipping lanes and military patrols, the answer should be nowhere. And yet the answer in this case is somewhere, because it did vanish. Completely. Totally. 23 years and counting. The FBI officially closed its investigation in 2005, not because they solved it, not because they found anything, but because 2 years of aggressive searching by the most powerful intelligence apparatus in the world had produced absolutely no leads, no wreckage on any coast, no sightings in any hangar, no informant chatter across any underground network. Nothing. Ben Padilla's family in Florida has never accepted the official silence. His sister Benita has spent decades pushing for answers. She doesn't believe her brother stole that plane. She believes he was taken, held under duress by captors hiding in the cabin, forced to help start the engines and taxi the aircraft, and then, once the plane was airborne, silenced and lost at sea along with the aircraft. But she has no proof. Nobody does, because there's nothing to find. Ben Padilla is still officially a missing person, not a fugitive, not a criminal. Just a 51-year-old American mechanic who walked out onto a tarmac in Angola one afternoon, climbed the stairs of an old airplane, and never came home. A 100-ton commercial jet took off into the African sunset, and it simply ceased to exist. On the afternoon of December 5, 1945, 5 American torpedo bombers took off from a naval base in Florida for a routine 3-hour training flight. Just a loop out over the Bahamas, drop some practice bombs, and come home in time for dinner. 14 men, 5 aircraft, perfect weather. By the time the sun went down that night, all 5 planes had vanished into the Atlantic Ocean. And when the Navy launched a giant flying boat to go rescue them, that plane vanished too. 13 more men. Gone, 6 aircraft, 27 men, 1 afternoon. The Navy's official 500-page report on the disaster ended with a sentence that has haunted aviation for 80 years. They said the planes had vanished as if they had flown to Mars. This is the story of Flight 19, and it is the story that birthed the modern legend of the Bermuda Triangle. Let me set the scene for you, because you have to understand where these men were in history. It is December 5th, 1945. World War II ended just 3 months ago. Naval Air Station Fort Lauderdale is a working military base, but the mood there has shifted. The war is over. The killing is done. Most of the pilots training here now aren't going to war anymore. They're finishing their qualifications, doing their hours, going through the motions of peacetime service. The base is disciplined, but the pressure of combat has finally lifted. The weather that afternoon is textbook Florida. Scattered clouds, a steady breeze, warm. If you're a pilot, this is the kind of day you dream about. Nothing to fight, nothing to fear, just fly. And the mission that afternoon is called Navigation Problem Number 1. It's a milk run, a triangular training flight out over the Atlantic. Head east, drop some practice bombs on a target called Hen and Chicken Shoals in the Bahamas, then loop north, then head west, back to base. 3 hours, tops. They'll be home before dark. The squadron is 5 Grumman TBM Avenger torpedo bombers. These are heavy, muscular, single-engine aircraft, built for war, nicknamed the Iron Bird because of how much punishment they could take. They are among the toughest planes the Navy has ever put in the sky. The man leading the flight is Lieutenant Charles C. Taylor. And here's where you have to pay attention. Because the whole legend of Flight 19 depends on the idea that Taylor was some green rookie who got lost. He was not. Taylor was a decorated World War II combat veteran. He'd flown combat missions off the aircraft carrier USS Hancock in the Pacific. He had over 2,500 total flight hours. This wasn't his first rodeo. It wasn't his 100th rodeo. Behind him, in the other 4 Avengers, are his students, Marine captains, a Navy ensign, a Marine second lieutenant. Each one has about 300 hours in the cockpit, 60 of them in the Avenger. They're less experienced than Taylor by a huge margin. But here's the little detail that's going to matter later. Taylor is brand new to Fort Lauderdale. He just transferred over from Naval Air Station Miami. He doesn't really know this stretch of the Bahamas. His students do. They fly it all the time. Remember that. It's important. At 2:10 p.m., 25 minutes behind schedule because Taylor showed up late, the 5 Avengers roar off the runway at Fort Lauderdale and climb into a blue sky. They head east. Everything is fine. The bombing run at Hen and Chickens goes off without a hitch at 3 o'clock. Standard exercise, standard formation. The men joke on the radio. They start the loop north, and then, at 3:40 p.m., another pilot who happens to be flying nearby, a Lieutenant Robert Cox, intercepts a radio transmission that stops his heart. It's Taylor. And Taylor sounds scared. He's telling somebody in his squadron that both of his compasses have gone out, both of them. And he thinks somehow that they're all over the Florida Keys, in the Gulf of Mexico, on the completely wrong side of Florida. Now, this is where it gets strange, because they're not over the Keys, they're not even close. They are exactly where they're supposed to be, north of the Bahamas, out over the Atlantic Ocean. But Taylor's convinced he's on the wrong side of the state, and he's about to turn his entire squadron the wrong way to try and fix it. Cox tries to help. He gets on the radio. He tells Taylor, "Put the sun on your port wing and fly north. That'll bring you home." Basic stuff. Sun navigation. Any pilot can do it, but the radio channels are a nightmare. This is 1945 radio technology. And to make it worse, the training frequency Taylor is stuck on is being flooded with static and interference from commercial radio stations broadcasting out of Cuba. Half of what anybody says gets lost. At 4:45 p.m., ground control gives Taylor a direct instruction. Switch to the emergency search and rescue channel, 3000 kilohertz. It's clean. It's designated for exactly this situation. Get on the clear channel and we can guide you home. Taylor refuses. He says he needs to stay on the training frequency to keep contact with his students. That refusal is one of the most fatal decisions in aviation history, because at 4:56 p.m., someone else on the flight, one of Taylor's students, gets on the radio, and this is a direct quote from the transcript. He says, "Damn it, if we could just fly west, we would get home. Head west, damn it." Think about that for a second. One of those young pilots knew. He knew they were east of Florida. He knew all they had to do was point the plane at the setting sun and fly. But he couldn't. Because in the United States Navy in 1945, you do not disobey your flight leader. Even when your flight leader is wrong. Even when your flight leader is about to fly you into the ocean. At 5:50 p.m., land-based radio stations managed to triangulate Flight 19's position. They locate it precisely. The squadron is safely north of the Bahamas, east of Florida, exactly where the student said they were. Just fly west, boys. You'll hit land in an hour. But they can't hear the message. The static is too heavy. The channel is a mess. And then, at 6:04 p.m., Taylor makes the final fatal call. He orders the formation to turn east, deeper into the Atlantic, away from Florida, into the setting darkness, because he still believes he's over the Gulf of Mexico and he thinks flying east will bring him home. The last real transmission comes at 8:20 p.m. Taylor is calm now, resigned. He ordered the formation to prepare for a coordinated emergency water landing, stating his final instruction: "All planes close up tight. When the first plane drops below 10 gallons, we all go down together." And then, silence. The Navy scrambles fast. At 7:27 p.m., a massive Martin PBM-5 Mariner flying boat lifts off from a base up the coast, 13 men on board. This plane is huge. It's built for exactly this kind of ocean rescue. Long range, massive fuel tanks. It can stay airborne for hours searching the water. 20 minutes after takeoff, at 7:50 p.m., the crew of a nearby ocean liner, the SS Gaines Mills, sees something out over the water. A massive orange fireball in the sky. A mid-air explosion. Debris rains into the ocean. At the exact same moment, back at the base, the Mariner drops off the radar screen. 6 aircraft gone. 27 men gone in a single afternoon. Okay, stop the tape. Because this is where the official Navy story starts to fall apart. For decades, the Navy's position has been simple. Taylor got confused. He led his students into the open ocean. They ran out of fuel. They ditched. They sank. Sad. Preventable. Human error. Case closed. But wait a minute. Let's actually think about this. Problem 1. The compasses. Taylor said both of his compasses failed. Both. On a single aircraft. That is already an extreme mechanical anomaly. But even if you accept that, so what? There were 5 planes in that squadron. Each one had its own compasses. Each one had its own instruments. Each pilot was independently trained in dead reckoning navigation. Why didn't the other 4 pilots simply check their own instruments, confirm their own headings, radio Taylor and say, "Sir, respectfully, our compasses are working just fine and we are east of Florida, not west"? How does an entire squadron of combat-trained pilots blindly follow a leader who has openly admitted his instruments are broken? Especially when at least one of them, on the recorded transcript, is literally screaming into the radio that they should fly west. Problem 2. The missing wreckage. Let's say the whole thing plays out exactly like the Navy said. 5 Avengers run dry, ditch in the ocean off the coast of Florida. Ditching an Avenger in the Atlantic is dangerous, but the plane is designed to float for a bit. The pilots have life vests. The planes have inflatable life rafts. The United States military, in December of 1945, launched one of the largest peacetime search and rescue operations in history to find them. Hundreds of ships, hundreds of aircraft, thousands of hours of coordinated searching over thousands of square miles, and they did not find a single thing. No oil slick, no debris, no life jacket, no scrap of aluminum from an Avenger, no body, nothing. 5 heavy metal aircraft did not just evaporate, something happened to them. But whatever happened, it happened in a way that left zero trace on the surface of the ocean. Problem 3. The rescue plane. Now, hold on a second. Let's really look at that PBM Mariner. The official Navy explanation is that the Mariner suffered a fuel vapor explosion. This wasn't unprecedented. The PBM was nicknamed the Flying Gas Tank for a reason. It had a documented history of fuel vapor leaks that could ignite. But what are the statistical odds of that? On the exact same night that 5 military aircraft vanish without a trace, the massive rescue plane sent to find them explodes in mid-air 20 minutes after takeoff, under a completely clear sky, in a location that just happens to be right along the search path. Now, we have 6 aircraft and 27 men gone in a single afternoon. That's not a coincidence. That's a pattern. But nobody has ever been able to explain what the pattern actually is. The Navy's investigation into Flight 19 went on for months. The final report ran over 500 pages. And when the board finally sat down to write their conclusion, they could not agree on what had happened. They tried to pin the blame on Taylor. His mother fought back. She refused to let her son go down in history as the man who killed 13 other pilots because he couldn't read a compass. And she won. The official Navy verdict was quietly amended. Cause unknown. The final line of the report contains that phrase that everyone who has ever studied this case remembers. The board concluded that the 5 Avengers had vanished as if they had flown to Mars. 20 years later, in 1964, a writer named Vincent Gaddis published an article in a men's adventure magazine called Argosy. He used the disappearance of Flight 19 and the rescue plane as his centerpiece, and he coined a phrase, the Bermuda Triangle. The legend was born right there, right in that magazine article, built on the bones of 14 young pilots who took off on a routine training flight on a beautiful Florida afternoon and never came home. 27 men, 6 aircraft, vanished on a sunny day. The Atlantic Ocean is deep and it keeps its secrets, and somewhere down there, on the ocean floor, 5 Grumman Avengers and 1 flying boat are resting in the dark, exactly where they went down. 80 years later, nobody has ever found them. Not a single one. On November 14, 1957, 6 days after Pan American Flight 7 vanished over the Pacific Ocean, a United States Navy aircraft carrier finally found it. Not the plane, just what was left. A debris field of luggage, seat cushions, and floating pieces of aluminum spread out across a stretch of the empty Pacific, nearly 100 miles north of the flight's planned route. And then they pulled the bodies out of the water, 19 of them, most of them wearing fully strapped, fully inflated life jackets, their shoes carefully removed and lined up, their wristwatches all stopped at nearly the same minute. And when the medical examiners ran the autopsies weeks later, the bodies came back saturated with lethal levels of carbon monoxide. This was supposed to be a 5-star vacation in the sky. Champagne, 7-course dinners, a cocktail lounge on the lower deck. This was Pan Am at the absolute peak of its power. Instead, it became one of the darkest and one of the most unsolved crashes in the history of commercial aviation. Let me take you back to the world this happened in, because you have to feel the elegance of it to understand why the ending is so disturbing. It's November 8th, 1957. San Francisco is cool and clear. And on the tarmac at San Francisco International sits one of the most beautiful commercial airliners ever built, a Boeing 377 Stratocruiser. This plane isn't just transportation. In 1957, it's a status symbol, a double-decker fuselage, passenger seats that convert into sleeping berths, a spiral staircase leading down to a lower-deck cocktail lounge where you can drink martinis at 10,000 feet. This particular Stratocruiser has a name. Pan Am gave every one of its long-haul planes a nickname, and this one is called Clipper Romance of the Skies. Because that's the sales pitch of the era. Flying is romance. Flying is glamour. Flying is a movie star lifestyle you can buy a ticket to. The mission tonight is a straight shot from San Francisco to Honolulu. 44 people on board, 36 passengers, 8 crew. The passengers are a cross-section of post-war America, businessmen, vacationing couples, a newlywed couple on their honeymoon, families with children, people who saved for years to afford this trip. At the controls is Captain Gordon Brown. And this matters, so pay attention. Captain Brown is not a rookie, not even close. He is a Pan Am veteran with over 14,000 flight hours. He knows the Pacific route the way you know your commute to work. This is a routine flight for him. He has done it, and hundreds of others just like it, dozens of times. Behind him in the passenger cabin sit 2 men you need to remember. One is a passenger named William Harrison Payne. The other is a member of the crew, the purser, a man named Eugene Crosthwaite. We'll come back to them. At 11:51 in the morning, Pacific Standard Time, the Stratocruiser lifts off from San Francisco under a clear blue sky, banks toward the west, and climbs out over the Pacific Ocean toward Hawaii. For the first 5 hours, everything is beautiful. The weather that afternoon is exactly what you'd want. Smooth air, scattered clouds far below. The Stratocruiser is cruising at 10,000 feet, engines humming, passengers being served drinks in the lounge. At 5:04 p.m., Captain Brown radios in a routine position report. He gives his coordinates. He states they are cruising smoothly. Everything is normal, nothing to report. He's about 1,000 nautical miles east of Hawaii. On schedule, on course, on altitude. That is the last time anyone hears Captain Brown's voice. Somewhere in the next few minutes, out over the empty middle of the Pacific Ocean, something starts to go wrong on Pan Am Flight 7. And here's the thing. Nobody on the ground knows. Nobody at Pan Am, nobody at the Coast Guard, nobody at the FAA. Because the check-in was normal, and the next scheduled check-in isn't for another hour. By 6:42 p.m., when the plane misses that check-in, Pan Am starts to worry. They try to raise the aircraft. Nothing. They try again. Silence. And that silence is when the machine of the United States Navy starts to spin up. For 6 days, the Pacific Ocean gets torn apart. Search planes, ships, cargo vessels diverted from their routes to help. Thousands of square miles of open water combed by hundreds of eyes. And then, on November 14th, the USS Philippine Sea, a Navy aircraft carrier deployed to lead the search, spots the field of debris, roughly 900 miles northeast of Honolulu, and, critically, about 90 miles north of the actual flight path Captain Brown was supposed to be on. What they pull out of the water is not the story of a plane exploding in mid-air. It's the story of something much stranger. Okay, this is where you have to stop and really think about what the Navy actually found, because the physical evidence doesn't match any of the obvious explanations. Let's start with the bodies. 19 victims recovered from the ocean. Many of them were wearing life jackets, fully strapped on, fully inflated. Their shoes had been carefully removed, which is standard procedure for a water landing because shoes can weigh you down or damage the emergency slides. Some of them had watches on their wrists, and those watches had all stopped at almost exactly the same moment. Around 4:26 in the afternoon, local Hawaii time, which converts to about 6:26 Pacific. Now, think about what that means. That's over an hour after Captain Brown's last normal radio call, which means for at least 60, 70, maybe 80 minutes, somebody on that airplane knew something was wrong. Long enough to make an announcement, long enough to hand out life jackets, long enough for the passengers to strap them on and take off their shoes and prepare for a controlled ditching in the Pacific Ocean. But wait a minute, let's really look at that. If the crew had over an hour to prepare the cabin, why did Captain Brown never call for help? It takes 3 seconds to key the microphone and say the word Mayday. 3 seconds. and Captain Brown, a 14,000-hour veteran, in the middle of a slow-motion emergency giving him enough time to prepare his entire cabin for a water landing, never got out a single clear distress call to anyone. That is not a coincidence. That is impossible under normal circumstances. Something was preventing that crew from talking to the ground. And that is where the autopsies start to speak. Because when the medical examiners ran the tissue samples, they found something that should not have been there. Elevated, lethal, saturating levels of carbon monoxide, not in 1 or 2 bodies, in 14 of the 19, including Captain Brown himself. Carbon monoxide is a slow, silent, invisible killer. You don't smell it. You don't see it. It just makes you sleepy, confused, and eventually unconscious. And in the confined space of an aircraft cabin, it turns a plane full of people into a plane full of ghosts. So the picture starts to sharpen. Somewhere over the Pacific, gas started flooding into the fuselage. The crew realized something was wrong. They started the emergency drill. Life jackets, shoes off, brace positions. But the same gas that was going to kill the passengers was also poisoning the flight crew as they tried to work. Captain Brown was losing his ability to think, losing his ability to remember to broadcast a mayday, losing his ability to fly the airplane. And the Stratocruiser drifted 90 miles off course before finally coming down. Now, where did the carbon monoxide come from? There are 2 doors that theory opens, and both of them are dark. Door number 1 is mechanical. Behind the Stratocruiser's smooth exterior sits 4 Pratt & Whitney Wasp major engines. These are the largest piston engines ever put into commercial service. Massive, powerful, and notorious for a specific catastrophic failure called a runaway propeller. If a propeller loses its governor at high speed, it can spin out of control, tear itself free of the engine mount, and in some cases, actually slice into the fuselage of the plane. And when investigators sorted through the recovered debris, they found something that fit that pattern. A piece of an engine cowl ring embedded in a scorched pillow. A runaway propeller could have started a cabin fire, and a cabin fire produces carbon monoxide. Door number 2 is much worse, because it's not an accident. That brings us back to those 2 names, William Harrison Payne. Passenger, middle-aged, deeply in debt, and here is his background, and this is going to hit you. Payne was a former Navy underwater demolitions expert, a frogman, a man specifically trained by the United States military to work with explosives, particularly around water. In the weeks before this flight, Payne took out 3 separate life insurance policies with a combined payout of over $120,000, that is millions in today's money. One of those policies included a double indemnity clause, meaning it paid double in the event of accidental death. He bought a one-way ticket to Hawaii, telling his family he was going to collect a small debt, a debt worth less than the ticket cost him to fly there. And when the Navy pulled 19 bodies out of the Pacific, William Harrison Payne's body was not among them. His body was never recovered. Ever. And in a bizarre postscript after his death, his widow's lodge back home mysteriously burned down. Then there's the crew member, Eugene Crosthwaite, the purser, the man in charge of the cabin. Days before this flight, Crosthwaite altered his will and left a copy of it in the glove box of his car at the airport. He had recently lost his wife. He was reportedly deeply depressed, openly angry at Pan Am, combative with his co-workers. Was one of these men responsible? Did Payne detonate a device in the cargo hold to secure a payout for his family? Did a crew member intentionally manipulate the cabin's ventilation system to incapacitate the flight? The Civil Aeronautics Board investigated all of it. They found no smoking gun, no definitive bomb residue, no confession, no mechanical fault they could prove. In January of 1959, the Civil Aeronautics Board issued its final report on Pan American Flight 7. After more than a year of investigation, after autopsies and metallurgy and interviews and speculation, the board's official conclusion was this: no probable cause could be determined. That's it. That's the ending. That's what the United States government offered the families of 44 dead people. A shrug. 68 years later, the case is still open in the sense that it has never been closed. Nobody has ever proven what killed Pan Am Flight 7. Was it a runaway propeller that cracked the fuselage and filled the plane with poison gas? Was it William Payne triggering an explosive device in the cargo hold? Was it an intentional act of system manipulation by a rogue crew member? Was it some combination of things nobody has thought of yet? We don't know, and we may never know. The Stratocruiser Clipper Romance of the Skies, the crown jewel of Pan Am's Pacific Fleet, took off from San Francisco on a beautiful November afternoon in 1957, banked west toward Hawaii, and somewhere in the middle of the sea, in the quiet golden hour before the Pacific sunset, it slowly, silently filled with poison. And then it fell out of the sky. And it left behind only floating life jackets, a few stopped watches, and a mystery that no one has ever managed to solve. Somewhere over the western Pacific, in the middle of a clear, dark night in March of 1962, the crew of a Liberian oil tanker looked up and saw the sky rip open. A blinding flash of white light, an orange-red halo around it, and then two burning objects tumbling separately out of that fireball and falling into the black ocean below. The tanker steamed straight toward the impact site. Their radar tracked the debris hitting the water, and when they got there, they found nothing. No wreckage, no oil slick, no bodies, not one piece of luggage. What they had watched fall out of the sky was a heavily loaded American military airliner carrying 107 people, 96 of them soldiers, most of them elite, all of them heading into a war the United States government wasn't publicly admitting was even happening yet. The largest peacetime search in the history of the U.S. Navy was launched the next morning. Over 1,300 personnel, 48 aircraft, 8 ships, 200,000 square miles of ocean combed inch by inch. They found absolutely nothing. And 63 years later, the U.S. government still refuses to put those soldiers' names on the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Wall. This is the story of Flying Tiger, Line Flight 739. And it's one of the darkest, most quietly buried mysteries in American military history. Let me take you back to the world this happened in, because you have to feel the political weight of it to understand why the ending is so infuriating. It's March of 1962. President John F. Kennedy is in the White House. The Cold War is at full boil. Cuba is a fresh wound. Berlin is a fresh wound. And halfway around the world, a small country in Southeast Asia called South Vietnam is starting to become a very big problem. Officially, the United States is not at war in Vietnam. Officially, what Kennedy is doing, quietly, off the record, is beefing up something called the Military Assistance Advisory Group, or MAAG. He's sending in specialists, communications experts, rangers, Green Berets in everything but name, men who are going to teach and support the South Vietnamese army in its fight against the Viet Cong, combat troops in every practical sense, just not on paper. Because if you call them combat troops, then you're at war, and Kennedy is not ready to admit that yet. To get those men to Vietnam, the U.S. military charters civilian airliners. It's cleaner that way, less official, less traceable. One of the companies they use is Flying Tiger Line, a well-respected air freight carrier. And on March 15, 1962, one of Flying Tiger's biggest planes, a Lockheed L-1049 Super Constellation, lifts off from Travis Air Force Base in California, headed west across the Pacific. Its final destination is Tan Son Nhut in Saigon. There are 107 people on board, 11 civilian crew hired by Flying Tiger. The captain is a man named Gregory P. Thomas, 48 years old, almost 20,000 flight hours, over 3,500 of them in this exact aircraft. 5 years earlier, he had actually saved every soul on a stricken DC-6 by executing a flawless emergency water landing in the Pacific. This is not a pilot who folds under pressure. Behind him in the cabin sit the passengers, 3 South Vietnamese military personnel, and 93 U.S. Army specialists, communications experts, electronics specialists, Ranger-trained soldiers heading into what is about to become one of the ugliest wars of the century. And here is the detail that tells you everything about how secret this trip is. Before they boarded, those 93 American soldiers were ordered to leave behind their dog tags, their wedding rings, their family photographs, anything that could identify them if something went wrong. Total deniability. That is what the U.S. government wanted. Total deniability is exactly what it got. The plane hopscotches across the Pacific, Honolulu, Wake Island, Guam, standard leapfrog route, and in Guam is where you need to pay attention. Because in the middle of that stopover, for 1 hour and 33 minutes, this heavily loaded top-secret military transport was left completely unattended on a dimly lit corner of the tarmac at Andersen Air Force Base. Nobody watching it, nobody guarding it, nobody near it. That is going to matter later. At 12:57 Greenwich Mean Time, Flight 739 lifts off from Guam and climbs into a beautiful cloudless Pacific night. The weather is perfect. No storms, no turbulence, no mechanical warnings. This should be one of the easiest legs of the entire trip. At 14:22 Greenwich Mean Time, Captain Thomas radios in a completely routine position report. He gives his coordinates. He states he's cruising at 18,000 feet. He estimates his arrival at the next waypoint in about an hour. Everything nominal, nothing to report. That is the last time anyone hears Captain Thomas's voice. At 15:30 Greenwich Mean Time, roughly an hour later, ground control tries to raise Flight 739 for its next scheduled check-in. Silence. They try again. Still silence. And now the machine starts to spin. Because 107 men on a classified military charter don't just stop responding to the radio for no reason. But something else is happening at that exact moment, thousands of miles away, right underneath the flight path. The crew of a Liberian supertanker called the SSTL Lenzen is on watch under a clear night sky. And they look up, and they see in their exact position, in the exact vicinity, Flight 739 was supposed to be passing overhead an enormous flash of light in the sky, bright enough to illuminate the deck of their ship, a luminous structured explosion, a white nucleus in the middle ringed by a reddish-orange halo. And then 2 separate burning objects fall out of the explosion at different speeds and plummet into the ocean. The tanker's captain turns the ship immediately. They steam straight toward the impact site. They track the falling debris on their surface radar until it hits the water. They mark the exact coordinates. They radio the sighting. And when they arrive at the impact zone, they find nothing. That is the last real chapter of this story that has any resolution. Everything after that is silence and unanswered questions. Okay, stop the tape. Because the official story falls apart almost immediately once you start looking at it. The Civil Aeronautics Board eventually ruled that Flight 739 exploded in mid-air. Fine. The tanker crew saw the explosion. There is no reasonable person who disputes that a violent event occurred. But every question that logically follows that explosion leads to an impossibility. Problem 1. The debris. When a Lockheed Super Constellation explodes over the ocean, it does not evaporate. This is a 90,000-pound aircraft. It has aluminum skin, it has aviation fuel, it has seat cushions and pressurized life vests and metal luggage lockers, and hundreds of pounds of paperwork and personal effects. When it comes apart at 18,000 feet, that debris rains down over miles of ocean. Everything that floats stays on the surface for days. The U.S. Navy launched what was, at the time, the largest peacetime search operation in the history of the Pacific. Over 1,300 personnel involved, 48 aircraft in the air, 8 surface ships combing the water, 200,000 square miles of ocean. That's an area larger than the state of California. They found nothing. Not a seat cushion, not a life jacket, not a scrap of uniform, not an oil sheen on the water. Zero. Now, this is where it gets strange, because the tanker steamed directly to the impact site right after seeing the explosion. Not later, not the next day, right then. The debris field should have been sitting right there on the surface, still smoking, and it wasn't. How does a massive airliner explode in mid-air on a clear night right in front of eyewitnesses on a ship and leave absolutely no physical trace on the ocean? That is not what happens when planes crash. That is what happens when someone erases something. Problem 2. Sabotage. Let's go back to that unguarded 93 minutes on the tarmac in Guam. This was a classified military transport carrying elite communication specialists into a covert operation, and it was left sitting in a dimly lit corner of an airbase for an hour and a half with no security detail. That is a screaming, blinking red alert breach of protocol. Was there enough time during that unguarded window for an unauthorized device to be placed inside the aircraft? Yes, easily. And an hour and change is exactly enough of a delay for that device to detonate somewhere in the middle of the Pacific, far from any inconvenient witnesses. Was there anyone in Guam in March of 1962 with a motive to sabotage an airplane full of American elite specialists heading to Vietnam? The answer, geopolitically, is uncomfortably yes. Multiple parties, foreign intelligence, domestic sympathizers, the list gets long. The Civil Aeronautics Board could not investigate that theory in any meaningful way because there was no physical evidence to test, and that leads to the final and worst problem. Problem 3, the government's memory. Because the United States had not officially declared Vietnam a combat zone in March of 1962, the 93 American soldiers who boarded Flight 739 died in what the Department of Defense classified as a peacetime accident, not combat losses, not war casualties, not veterans of a conflict, just an unlucky training accident. That single bureaucratic classification has cascaded through the decades. The families of those men received a mere $264 in life insurance per soldier. That is not a typo. $264 for their son, for their brother, for their husband. And when the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Wall was built in Washington, D.C. in the early 1980s, those 93 names were denied inclusion. Because officially, they didn't die in Vietnam. They died on a routine flight to nowhere in particular. Their families have been fighting for decades to have their names added. To this day, that fight is still going on. Wait a minute, hold on. Really think about what that means. If you can prove that Flight 739 was carrying troops on a classified mission into a covert war, then those soldiers were combat casualties. And if they were combat casualties, then the U.S. government has to admit that its covert escalation in Vietnam was already underway in early 1962. 2 years before the Gulf of Tonkin incident, 2 years before Vietnam became public policy. That's a very ugly historical thing to admit. And a lot of people have suggested that it is exactly why those 93 names have never been added to the wall. The Civil Aeronautics Board's final report on Flying Tiger Line, Flight 739, concluded, essentially, nothing. The plane exploded. They couldn't determine why, because there was no evidence to work with. Case closed. But that report doesn't include what happened just 11 hours before Flight 739 vanished, because on the exact same day, a completely separate Flying Tiger Line super constellation, an identical L1049H, was attempting a landing at a naval air station on Adak Island in Alaska. It crashed. It burned. 2 identical airplanes, same airline, same day. 1 catastrophic accident and 1 impossible disappearance, 11 hours apart. The statistical odds of that are astronomical. And that is the whole story of Flight 739. It just becomes a stack of impossibilities on top of impossibilities. Explosions with no debris. Elite soldiers on classified missions. Unguarded aircraft on foreign tarmacs. Twin catastrophes on the same day. Insurance payouts of $264. Names denied on the wall. 107 people boarded a plane in Guam on a beautiful clear night in March of 1962. 96 of them were soldiers heading into a war that wasn't officially a war yet. They vanished into a fireball over the Pacific. And in every meaningful way, the United States government has spent the last 60 years pretending they were never there at all. They're not on the wall, they're not on the record. And somewhere out in the Western Pacific, in water thousands of feet deep, the wreckage of a Lockheed super constellation and the bones of 107 people are still lying in the dark, exactly where they went down, waiting for somebody to admit they existed. On a cold, gray morning in October of 1972, a small twin-engine Cessna took off from Anchorage, Alaska, and flew into the mountains. On board were 4 men. 2 of them were sitting members of the United States Congress. One of them was the second most powerful Democrat in Washington, and that same man had, just months earlier, publicly accused the director of the FBI of illegally tapping the phones of American politicians. They never arrived at their destination. The United States government launched what was, at the time, the largest search and rescue operation in American history. 40 military aircraft, the Coast Guard, civilian pilots by the hundreds. For 39 straight days, they combed 325,000 square miles of Alaskan wilderness. They flew 3,600 flight hours over the fjords and glaciers and mountain passes. They found nothing. Not a scrap of aluminum, not a piece of clothing, not a single body. 53 years later, they still haven't, and Hale Boggs, the House Majority Leader of the United States of America, remains to this day the highest-ranking American politician to ever vanish without a trace. This is the story of that flight. Let me set the scene for you, because you have to feel the political pressure of this moment to understand why this case never really goes away. It's October 16th, 1972. Richard Nixon is president. The Vietnam War is grinding on. Watergate has just started to leak into the newspapers, and in 3 weeks, the entire country is going to vote in a presidential election. Washington, D.C. is a snake pit. At the center of that snake pit sits a Louisiana Democrat named Hale Boggs, 58 years old, House Majority Leader, second in command of the Democratic Party in the House of Representatives. And Boggs is not a quiet politician. He picks fights. He picks the biggest fights he can find. 9 years earlier, after President Kennedy was shot in Dallas, Boggs was appointed to the Warren Commission. That's the panel of very important people that investigated the assassination. And when the commission signed off on its official conclusion that a single bullet fired by a lone gunman named Lee Harvey Oswald caused all the wounds to Kennedy and Governor Connally, Boggs was one of the members who quietly said, "I don't buy it." He didn't sign on to the single bullet theory. He kept his mouth shut about it publicly, mostly. But by 1971, Boggs had stopped keeping his mouth shut. He walked onto the floor of the House of Representatives and openly accused J. Edgar Hoover, the founding director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, of illegally wiretapping the phones of American politicians. He said Hoover had, quote, lied his eyes out to the Warren Commission. He called for Hoover's resignation to the face of the most feared man in Washington. Now, hold on a second, and think about what that means politically. In 1972, if you were a sitting congressman, you did not go to war with J. Edgar Hoover in public. Hoover had files on everyone. Hoover made and destroyed careers. He had ruled the FBI for almost 50 years. Attacking him in public was a career-ending choice. Hale Boggs did it anyway, and that is the man who, on a rainy morning in Anchorage, climbs into a small airplane. He isn't alone. Alongside him is Nick Begich, 40-year-old freshman congressman from Alaska. In the middle of a tight re-election race, Nick's aide, Russell Brown, is with them, and the pilot is a local named Don Johns. Now, here's where the story gets uncomfortable, because Johns is the one man on that airplane who was actually paid to make good decisions. And his track record for making good decisions was, at best, mixed. Johns was 38 years old and owned his own charter company, Pan Alaska Airways. He had over 17,000 flight hours. That is a genuinely huge number. He was legendary in Alaskan bush pilot circles. But he was also known as a maverick who flew into weather other pilots refused to touch. And just weeks before this flight, Don Johns published an article in Flying magazine. The title of that article was Ice Without Fear. In the article, Johns wrote that a pilot could disregard 99% of the stuff you hear about icing if you were, quote, sneaky, smart, and careful. Remember that sentence? At 6:56 in the morning of October 16th, Don Johns calls the Anchorage Flight Service station for a weather briefing. And what they tell him is not good. The forecast for the route to Juneau is a mess. Warm front pushing through, dense fog, extreme turbulence, and moderate rime icing between 6,000 feet and 15,000 feet. For any pilot, that briefing is a red flag. For a pilot flying a small Cessna 310C without de-icing equipment, without an autopilot, in aggressive Alaskan winter conditions, that briefing should have been a full stop. This was a Part 91 flight, meaning it was totally uncontrolled. Jans was not legally required to fly. Nobody would have blamed him for canceling. Jans decides to go anyway. At 8 a.m., he fuels the Cessna to full capacity. That gives him 6 hours of flight time. At 8:55 a.m., the four men lift off from Anchorage International Airport, runway 24R, into gray marginal skies. At 9 a.m., air traffic controllers back at the tower catch one last visual glimpse of the airplane through binoculars, 2 miles out, heading southeast at 2,000 feet. At 9:09 a.m., Johns gets on the radio to file a formal flight plan. He filed it from the air. He says he'll be flying visually south down a route called Victor 317, then out to the Alaskan coast at Yakutat, then finally direct to Juneau. That is the last transmission from the aircraft. No mayday, no panic, no engine trouble reports, no radio call about icing, no frantic weather deviation request, just silence. And then, in Juneau, hours later, the men who were waiting for a fundraiser luncheon started to realize their guests of honor weren't coming. Okay. Now this is where you need to stop and really look at what did and did not happen after this plane vanished. Because the official story, the boring accident theory, is not actually as boring as it sounds. The official conclusion, without evidence, was controlled flight into terrain. In pilot language, that means Johns iced up, or he lost control in turbulence, and he flew the airplane into the side of a mountain or into the ocean. Fine, that's plausible on paper. But wait a minute, really look at the search. Problem 1, the missing plane. The United States military, the Coast Guard, and hundreds of civilian pilots ran the biggest search in American history at that time. 39 days, 40 aircraft, 3,600 flight hours. Almost 400,000 square miles of Alaskan wilderness combed inch by inch, grid patterns, low-altitude sweeps, photographs of every valley and every glacier. And the target of the search was not a huge search area, mathematically. Johns had filed his own route. Everyone knew, roughly, the corridor where the plane had to have gone down. This was not a 767 vanishing over the open ocean. This was a small Cessna, painted white with bright orange trim that should have been sitting somewhere on a snowy mountainside, making itself extremely visible against the white background. They found nothing. Nothing metallic on a mountain slope, nothing in the water off the Alaskan coast, no oil slick, no slick of gasoline on the snow, not one seat cushion floating in a bay, not one duffel bag hanging from a tree. How does that happen? How do 40 planes flying grid patterns for over a month miss the crash site of a Cessna in a corridor everyone knew it had to have crossed? Problem 2, the silent beacon. By 1972, Alaska had a brand new law on the books. Every airplane operating in Alaskan airspace was required to be equipped with an emergency locator transmitter, an ELT. It's a small orange box mounted in the tail of the aircraft, and it's designed to do exactly one thing. When the airplane crashes hard, the ELT switches on automatically and starts broadcasting a loud screaming radio ping on a specific emergency frequency. Any rescue aircraft flying within range picks it up instantly and homes in on the signal like a heat-seeking missile. Johns' Cessna never made a peep, not a chirp, not a warble, nothing. Now, why? Well, it turns out when investigators later looked into it, they found something disturbing. Johns' portable ELT was not in his airplane on the morning of October 16th. It was sitting in a completely different aircraft on the tarmac at Fairbanks. He had left it behind. Or, and this is the darker interpretation, someone had removed it before takeoff. And that leads us to the biggest problem of all. Problem 3, the motive. You can't talk about this case without talking about the political landscape. Because it is genuinely bizarre, Hale Boggs, the man on that airplane, was the sitting House Majority Leader of the United States who had gone to war with J. Edgar Hoover in public. He had publicly rejected the single-bullet theory of the JFK assassination. He had, in the estimation of his supporters, made himself into one of the most inconvenient men in Washington. And 2 weeks before a presidential election, he vanished into thin air with zero physical trace. And now, here is the twist that lives in the shadow of this case. Decades later, in the 1990s and 2000s, a man named Jerry Max Pasley started talking to reporters. Pasley was an individual with a documented history in organized crime and explosives. He also happened to have married Nick Begich's widow, Peggy, in 1974, less than 2 years after the crash. And Pasley claimed, on the record, that just before the October 16th flight, that figures in Arizona had handed him a locked briefcase, stating that a major event was about to occur. Days later, the Cessna vanished. Pasley never fully explained what was in the briefcase. He never named the men in Anchorage. He never said he built the bomb himself. He just floated the story out there, unbelievably casually, and let it sit. Is Pasley a reliable witness? Absolutely not. He was a professional criminal with an axe to grind. But then again, an anonymous tip in the days after the disappearance told the FBI the caller knew the exact crash site. That caller was interviewed and described by an FBI agent as, quote, rational, extremely intelligent, but somewhat strange. The agent believed him. The information went nowhere, and ham radio operators in California picked up faint broadcasts in the days following the crash, claiming there were survivors somewhere in the wilderness. Those broadcasts were dismissed as hoaxes. Which of those things was a hoax? Which was real? Nobody knows, because the plane was never found. Hale Boggs and Nick Begich were officially declared dead by the courts on January 3, 1973. Neither man had a funeral in the traditional sense. There was no body to bury. There was no plot of soil to visit. There was only the vast, indifferent wilderness of southeastern Alaska. Boggs's house seat in Louisiana was won a few months later by his wife, Lindy Boggs, who served in Congress for another 18 years. Begich's Alaska seat was won by a young Republican named Don Young, who then held that seat for the next 49 years. In one afternoon, in one small airplane, the political map of 2 entire states was rewritten. And to this day, Hale Boggs remains the highest-ranking sitting American politician to ever disappear without a trace. 53 years later, the Alaskan mountains have not returned him. They have not returned Nick Begich. They have not returned Russell Brown. And they have not returned Don Johns. Not a bolt, not a photograph, not a wristwatch, nothing. A powerful man who had made powerful enemies flew into the fog one October morning in 1972. He had been warning America about phone taps and cover-ups and lies from the top of the FBI. He had been questioning the official story of the assassination of a president. And then he was gone. The Alaskan wilderness kept its secret. It still does. Somewhere over the middle of the Pacific Ocean, on a Friday morning in July of 1937, the most famous pilot in the world was screaming into a microphone at a United States Coast Guard ship, begging the sailors to answer her. The ship was right there. She was almost directly overhead. The sailors could hear her voice come through their radio, loud and clear and increasingly terrified, but she could not hear a single word they said back to her. For nearly 2 hours, she transmitted blindly into the sky, unable to know if anyone in the world was listening. And then, at exactly 8:43 in the morning, local time, her voice came through the speaker on the Itasca one last time. We are on the line 157337. We will repeat this message. We will repeat this on 6,210 kilocycles. Wait. Then silence. Amelia Earhart, her navigator Fred Noonan, and their state-of-the-art Lockheed Electra 10E vanished from the surface of the Earth, and in nearly 90 years of searching, in one of the most expensive and obsessive manhunts of the modern era, we still don't know where they went. This is her story, but it's also the story of a single decision made 2 months earlier, in Miami, that may have killed her. Let me set the scene for you, because you have to feel where this world was to understand what she was actually attempting. It's the summer of 1937. Aviation is the frontier. Long-distance flights are the space race of the era. Every year, pilots push farther, faster, higher, and nobody has captured the imagination of the world like Amelia Earhart. She was the first woman to fly solo across the Atlantic Ocean. She's on the cover of every magazine. She has an audience with the president. She is, at this exact moment, the most famous woman on the planet. And what she is attempting to do in July of 1937 is the biggest thing anyone has ever tried in the sky. She is flying around the world at the equator. That is more than 29,000 miles, in sections, over jungles, over deserts, over oceans that nobody has ever mapped from the air. She has already completed most of the trip. She has flown east across South America, across Africa, across the Middle East, across India, and across Southeast Asia. She is on her final legs. And in the cockpit next to her sits a man whose name most people have forgotten, but you need to remember. His name is Fred Noonan. 44 years old, former merchant marine captain, and Noonan is not some assistant. Noonan is one of the greatest maritime navigators alive on Earth in 1937. He personally pioneered the trans-Pacific flying boat routes for Pan American Airways. He mapped the modern flight paths across the Pacific from scratch. If you were flying across the ocean in 1937 and you want to actually find where you're going, Fred Noonan is one of maybe 5 people in the world you want in your cockpit. Their airplane is a Lockheed Electra 10E Special, heavily modified. All the passenger seats have been ripped out. In their place sit 6 auxiliary fuel tanks, giving the aircraft a range of over 2,500 miles. It has a state-of-the-art 50-watt Western Electric radio transmitter. It is one of the most advanced private aircraft in the world. And on July 2nd, 1937, this crew is going to attempt the hardest leg of the entire trip. They are going to take off from Lae in New Guinea and fly 2,556 miles across the empty middle of the Pacific to land on Howland Island. Now, hold on a second. Let me tell you what Howland Island is, because you have to understand it. Howland Island is a piece of coral. It is 1.5 miles long. It is barely 20 feet above sea level. It is surrounded by millions of square miles of empty, featureless ocean. Finding it in an airplane, without GPS, without radar, using nothing but the sun, the stars, and Fred Noonan's celestial navigation, is one of the hardest challenges anyone has ever set for themselves in aviation. Waiting for them on Howland, just offshore, sits a United States Coast Guard cutter, the USS Itasca. Its job is simple. Its job is to help her find the island. And here's the decision that ruined everything. 2 months earlier, in Miami, Amelia had ordered her ground crew to remove a piece of equipment from the belly of the Electra. It was a 250-foot trailing wire antenna. It was heavy. It was awkward. It slowed the plane down. That antenna was the only piece of equipment that allowed her radio to transmit and receive on the 500 kilohertz low-frequency band. And the 500 kilohertz band was, in 1937, the international standard used by ships and their onboard direction-finding equipment. The Itasca was equipped to home in on a plane using 500 kilohertz. She had it removed to save weight. Nobody told her in language she fully understood what she was giving up. At midnight, Greenwich Mean Time, on July 2nd, the Electra rolls down the bumpy dirt runway at Lae, straining under the weight of over 1,000 gallons of fuel. Archival footage of the takeoff shows a puff of dust rising near the tail as the plane bounces along the strip. Some modern investigators believe that this is the moment the plane's belly-receiving antenna was sheared clean off by the runway. The Electra climbs into the sky and turns east into the rising dawn over the Pacific Ocean. For the next 14 hours, the flight is grim but manageable. They fight scattered rain squalls. They fight a headwind that at one point is blowing at 23 knots against them. Amelia radios in a position report at 7,000 feet, saying everything is okay. But the airplane is burning fuel faster than they planned because the headwind is slowing them down. By the time they get within radio range of Howland, roughly 19 hours into the flight, Amelia and Fred have been awake and working for nearly a full day. They are exhausted. They are running on adrenaline. and the sun is starting to rise in front of them, blinding them, making it almost impossible to visually search the ocean for the tiny coral atoll they need to find. And this is where the radio problem becomes fatal. At 7:42 a.m. local time, Amelia transmits, "We must be on you, but cannot see you. Gas is running low, have been unable to reach you by radio. We are flying at 1,000 feet. The Itasca hears her perfectly. Her signal is at its maximum strength, which means she is right there, right on top of them. The Itasca desperately radios back, giving her steering directions, telling her to fly a specific compass heading. Their transmissions reach out into the sky. She does not receive them. She cannot receive them. The belly antenna is gone, sheared off in New Guinea, or damaged in a takeoff 2 months earlier, or removed entirely in Miami. Whatever the reason, her radio is transmitting fine, but she is functionally deaf. For the next hour, she keeps talking, frantic, asking them to send her signals on her own frequency so she can home in on them with her direction finder. But her equipment isn't compatible with theirs. Every attempt fails. At 8:43 a.m., she gives her final position report. She and Fred have been flying up and down a navigational line called 157-337, sweeping north and south, hoping to spot Howland, but their fuel is nearly gone. And then, the microphone clicks off. For 88 years, we have been looking for her. Okay, this is where you need to slow down and look at what actually happened after 8:43 a.m. Because the official story, the boring one, has some very serious holes in it. The official Navy explanation, filed in the weeks after the disappearance, is called crash and sink. It says the Electra ran out of fuel, ditched into the deep ocean somewhere near Howland Island, and went straight to the bottom. But wait a minute. Problem 1. The post-loss signals. For the next 5 days after Amelia's final transmission, radio operators across the Pacific began picking up faint distress signals. Ham radio operators, Navy stations, 57 separate credible signals were logged, all of them on Amelia's exclusive assigned frequencies. Frequencies that nobody else was using. One of them was picked up by a 15-year-old girl in St. Petersburg, Florida, named Betty Clank, sitting in her family's living room, twisting the dial on her shortwave radio. Betty wrote down what she heard in a notebook, a woman's voice, desperate and crying, calling for help, saying the plane was on a reef, saying water was coming in. Now, hold on. That story sounds impossible. A teenager in Florida picking up a distress call from a woman in the middle of the Pacific. Radio propagation experts have looked at this over the years, and what they found is that at very specific times of day, atmospheric conditions can bounce shortwave signals off the ionosphere and carry them literally halfway around the world. Betty could have heard her. It's physically possible. But here's what really matters. An airplane's radio in 1937 doesn't run on batteries alone. It runs on a generator that spins off one of the engines, specifically the starboard engine. If the Electra sank into the deep ocean, the engine is submerged and drowned instantly. The radio cannot transmit, which means for those 5 days of signals to have been real, the plane had to be on land, or on a reef, above the water, with at least one engine intact enough to run occasionally. Problem 2. The Nikumaroro Bones. There's a tiny uninhabited island roughly 400 miles southeast of Howland. In 1937, it was called Gardner Island. Today, it's called Nikumaroro. And 3 years after Amelia disappeared, in 1940, a British colonial officer landed on Nikumaroro and found something disturbing. A partial human skeleton, a woman's shoe, a sextant box that matched the exact model Fred Noonan used. The British colonial doctor at the time examined the bones, declared them to belong to a short, stocky male, and then, incredibly, casually lost them. They were never seen again. Decades later, forensic anthropologists went back to the original 1940 measurements, and using modern methods, they concluded the bones almost certainly belonged to a tall woman of European descent, very close to Amelia Earhart's exact profile. Problem 3. The Japanese capture theory. A completely separate theory holds that Amelia and Fred were blown off course, crash-landed somewhere in the Japanese-controlled Marshall Islands, and were captured as suspected spies. This story has actually been repeated by multiple Marshall Islands elders over the decades, claiming to have seen a white woman and a white man in Japanese custody in 1937. Fine. But wait a minute. If they held the most famous American woman on the planet, why would they quietly dispose of her instead of using her as a diplomatic leverage point? She's a diplomatic goldmine. She's a hostage. She's a bargaining chip worth 10 times her weight in oil embargoes. The Japanese capture theory only makes sense if you assume the Japanese acted stupidly. And the Imperial Japanese military of 1937, whatever else it was not stupid. In the last few decades, the search for Amelia Earhart has moved from Navy vessels to deep-sea robots and private billionaires. Groups like the International Group for Historic Aircraft Recovery, TIJAR, have made repeated expeditions to Nikumaroro, dragging metal detectors across the reef. Other teams have dropped sonar rigs over the deep ocean near Howland Island. They have found suggestive things. A piece of metal that might be from the Electra, a jar that might have held cosmetics, traces of what might be a fire pit on the beach at Nikumaroro. Might. Nothing has ever been definitively confirmed as Amelia's Lockheed Electra 10E. 88 years later, one of the most photographed, most famous, most searched for people in the history of American aviation is still, in every meaningful sense, still up there. Still flying up and down a navigational line called 157-337. Still calling out on 3,105 kilocycles. Still asking whoever might be listening to please answer her. And somewhere, in an ocean so vast it beggars the human imagination, a young woman from Kansas and one of the greatest navigators of his generation are lying in the dark, waiting to be found. It's just past midnight on June 24th, 1950. Somewhere over Lake Michigan, a commercial airliner packed with 58 people vanishes from the sky. There is no mayday, no distress call, nothing. And when the sun comes up the next morning, all the Coast Guard finds are seat cushions, a floating logbook, and a debris field so devastated that the largest piece of the actual airplane they will ever recover is, in the words of the Coast Guard captain on the scene, no bigger than your hand. No wreckage, no engines, no fuselage, and 75 years later, despite billionaires with sonar rigs and government agencies mapping every inch of that lake, they still haven't found it. This is the story of Northwest Airlines Flight 2501. And what really happened out there over Lake Michigan is a mystery that only gets weirder the closer you look. Let me set the scene properly, because you have to feel this to understand it. It's Friday, June 23rd, 1950. New York City is having a warm summer evening. LaGuardia is buzzing. And here's what most people don't realize about this exact moment in history. This is the eve of the Korean War. Literally hours later, President Truman is going to commit U.S. forces to Korea, and the whole world is going to shift. But right now, on this warm Friday night, none of that matters yet. What matters is that a shiny silver Douglas DC-4 is boarding passengers headed west. Flight 2501 is a transcontinental air coach. It's going all the way from New York to Seattle, with stops in Minneapolis and Spokane. 55 passengers, 27 women, 22 men, 6 children, 3 crew, 58 souls in total. When this plane goes down, it's going to become the deadliest commercial aviation disaster in American history up to that point. Now, you have to understand what flying was like in 1950. This wasn't the sanitized, pressurized, 35,000 feet above the weather experience we know today. In 1950, commercial planes weren't pressurized, and that meant one thing: they had to fly low, below 10,000 feet, which meant when they hit weather, they couldn't just climb above it. They had to fly through it. And the man flying this plane is not some rookie. Captain Robert Lind, 35 years old, 9 years with Northwest Airlines, over 900 hours of instrument-only flying under his belt. In the last 90 days alone, he'd flown 105 hours in this exact type of plane on this exact route. His first officer, Vern Wolf, is just as sharp. Their stewardess, Bonnie Ann Feldman, is 25 years old, and and she's about to shepherd 55 people through a summer thunderstorm at 3,000 feet with no cabin pressurization, no seatbelt sign, and no way to warn the passengers what's coming. Hold that image in your head, because this crew is about to fly directly into hell. The takeoff at 7:30 p.m. is textbook. Clear skies out of New York. They climb to 6,000 feet and start pushing west. Everything is normal. Then they hit Ohio. Around 10:49 p.m., passing over Cleveland, Captain Lind gets on the radio and asks air traffic control if he can descend from 6,000 down to 4,000 feet. He can see the storm brewing ahead, and he's trying to sneak under it. A TC approves. But here's the thing. That storm isn't just a storm. It's a squall line. Imagine a wall of thunder and lightning stretching for hundreds of miles, crackling with electricity, alive with updrafts and downdrafts strong enough to rip the wings off an aircraft. And Lind is flying a plane that literally cannot climb over it. At 11:29 p.m., ATC pushes him down again, this time to 3,500 feet, because there's another airplane out over Lake Michigan reporting severe turbulence, and they need to keep the two aircraft vertically separated. At 11:51 p.m., Lind radios in over Battle Creek, Michigan. He's holding at 3,500 feet. He estimates he'll be over Milwaukee by 11:37 Central Time. He sounds calm, professional, in control. Then, at 12:13 a.m., now well out over Lake Michigan, deep inside the storm, Lind makes one final call. He asks to drop lower, from 3,500 feet down to 2,500. Now, this is where the whole story turns strange, because any pilot will tell you the exact same thing. When you're trapped inside a violent thunderstorm, you do not dive into it. You get above it, you climb. Storms are worst in the middle and at the bottom. That's where the turbulence lives. That's where the wind shear and the microbursts and the downdrafts can literally slam you into the ground. You go up. So why did Captain Lind, a veteran with 900 hours of instrument time and 105 hours in this exact plane, ask to drop 1,000 feet closer to the pitch-black surface of Lake Michigan in the middle of the worst storm of the summer? We will never know. Because ATC denies the request. There's other traffic in the area. They tell him to hold at 3,500 feet. That is the last time anyone hears from Northwest Airlines Flight 2501. Now, somewhere in the next few minutes, something happens out there over the lake. And we know it happens because a handful of people on the ground actually witnessed it. There's a gas station owner in Glen, Michigan named William Bowie. There's a retired Navy lieutenant commander parked near him. And there are a couple of other locals who'd pulled their cars over to wait out the storm. All of them, independently, describe the same thing. They hear an airplane engine sputtering violently overhead. One of them said it sounded like a blown head gasket. They see a strange, funny yellow light moving through the sky. And then, out over the lake, a massive flash. A queer flash of light that briefly lit up Lake Michigan like a setting sun. Then, nothing. By 5:30 in the morning, the plane is officially overdue. Its fuel would be exhausted. The Coast Guard cutter Woodbine begins sweeping the fog-covered lake, and at 6:30 that evening, about 18 miles northwest of Benton Harbor, Michigan, they find what they were looking for. Sort of. They find an oil slick, floating cushions, a logbook, torn scraps of clothing, and evidence of an impact so catastrophic that the local prosecutor takes one look and calls it a terrific explosion. Not a crash. An explosion. Coast Guard Captain Nathaniel Fulford says the largest piece of the actual airplane they can find is no bigger than his hand. No bigger than your hand. From a plane that was over 90 feet long, weighing 35 tons, built from military-grade aluminum designed to survive combat in the Second World War. Okay, let's stop the tape right there, because this is where the official story starts to fall apart. The Civil Aeronautics Board's final report, released in January of 1951, basically shrugs. Cause unknown, insufficient evidence, case closed. But look at what we're actually dealing with. First problem, where is the plane? We are not talking about a paper aircraft. This is a Douglas DC-4, a converted military transport built to survive combat, powered by 4 massive Pratt & Whitney radial engines, each one generating 1,450 horsepower. The whole thing weighs 71,000 pounds, and it went down in a lake that's only about 150 feet deep at that location. For over 70 years, people have been looking for it, and not amateurs either. Clive Cussler's National Underwater Marine Agency, the same crew who found the CSS Hunley, they put teams on it. The Michigan Shipwreck Research Association has scoured the lakebed with high-resolution sonar. They have found and cataloged hundreds of wrecks down there: old wooden schooners, 19th-century steamships, small pleasure boats. But 4 massive metal engines and a 90-foot fuselage from a plane that supposedly crashed in a known debris zone? Nothing. The official explanation is that the wreckage sank into a 40-foot layer of thick mud on the lake floor. And maybe. But 40 feet of mud doesn't just swallow 4 radial engines without a signature. Sonar can see through mud. It's found nothing. How does an airliner just disappear from a lake? Second problem. That altitude request. Why did Lind want to drop lower? Was the plane already critically damaged? Was ice building on the wings and forcing him down? Was he losing an engine and trying to nurse the aircraft toward the Michigan shoreline? Or, and here's where it gets interesting, was he trying to get under something in the sky? Because here is a detail the official report tried to bury. In the hours after the plane vanished, 2 different police officers in 2 different towns along the lake both reported seeing a bright red light hovering over Lake Michigan. I have to be careful with this one, because 1950 is the height of the post-war UFO craze. The Midwest that summer was flooded with sighting reports, so a red light in the sky could be a lot of things. A signal flare from a search boat, a weather balloon, ball lightning bouncing along the water. But the timing is uncomfortable. It is very uncomfortable. And it is part of why this case, more than most, keeps getting dragged into paranormal territory even by serious researchers. Third problem. The location itself. The debris field was found well outside the established commercial airway, meaning at some point in his final minutes, Lind either got knocked wildly off course by the storm, or he deliberately turned. Either way, the plane was not where it was supposed to be. Something was already wrong before the aircraft came apart. So what actually happened out there? The most reasonable, boring, and sad explanation is that the storm did it. That squall line was one of the worst of the season. A heavy, unpressurized aircraft flying at 3,500 feet through 60,000-foot tall thunderheads is a very small thing fighting a very big monster. Updrafts and downdrafts can tear a plane to pieces in seconds. The witness reports of the yellow flash could fit that too. A lightning strike hitting a fuel vapor line, a vent tank exploding mid-air. That would explain the severely shattered wreckage and the tiny pieces of debris, the sputtering engine the witnesses heard. But it doesn't explain the missing airplane, and it doesn't explain why an experienced captain wanted to dive deeper into the killing zone instead of climbing out of it. At the end of the day, 58 people boarded a plane at LaGuardia on a warm Friday night in 1950. They were going home. They were going to see family. They were going west. And at some point after midnight, over the pitch-black surface of Lake Michigan, in the middle of a storm that turned the sky into a battlefield, something happened to them. The families never got a wreck to visit. There is no grave marker over the water. The Coast Guard scooped up cushions and clothing and a few tragic remnants of the people who had been alive just hours before, and the rest of it, the plane itself, the passengers, the engines, the tail, all of it, sank into that lake and disappeared. And it's all still down there, somewhere, in the mud, in the dark. A packed airliner flew into a midnight storm. It broke apart, and Lake Michigan swallowed the wreckage whole. 75 years later, we still don't know why.